The reporters wanted to know about her lipstick. She was 25 years old. She had killed 309 men. She had been wounded 4 times. She had watched a boy she liked die next to her on her first day of combat, and then killed 2 German officers before lunch. She had spent 8 months in a city under siege, picking off enemy soldiers one by one from rooftops and rubble, until the Germans knew her name and her number and promised over loudspeakers to tear her into 309 pieces. And the American press wanted to know if Soviet women were allowed to wear makeup on the front lines. She paused. She looked at them. "There is no rule against it," she said. "But who has time to think of her shiny nose when a battle is going on?" They called her the girl sniper. They wrote about her boots. They complained that her uniform made her look fat. They treated her like a curiosity, a strange little creature from a strange country who happened to be very good at killing people. She tolerated it. For weeks, she tolerated it. She smiled for the cameras. She answered the questions. She stood next to Eleanor Roosevelt and shook hands with dignitaries and said the right things. Then she got to Chicago. She stood before a crowd of thousands, looked out at the men in the audience and said, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" Silence. Then a roar. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. The Soviets called her Lady Death. The Germans called her something worse. And the story of how a history student from Ukraine became the deadliest female sniper in the history of warfare, and then shamed an entire nation into action, is one of the most extraordinary stories of the Second World War. Lyudmila Belova was born on July 12, 1916, in Bila Tserkva, a city south of Kiev, in what was then the Russian Empire and is now Ukraine. Her father was a Communist Party member. Her mother raised the children. From the start, Lyudmila was competitive. She described herself as a tomboy who couldn't stand being outdone by boys in anything. Sports, games, schoolwork, it didn't matter. If a boy could do it, she had to prove she could do it better. At 14, her family moved to Kiev. She took a job in an arms factory. One day, she heard a boy at the factory bragging about his scores at the local shooting range. That was enough. She went to the range the next day, enrolled in a sharpshooter class, and discovered that she could shoot better than every boy in the building. She earned her Voroshilov sharpshooter badge, a civil decoration that marked her as an elite marksman. She enrolled in sniper school and spent 2 years studying rifle mechanics, practical shooting, and the theory of long-range marksmanship. By the time she entered Kiev University to study history in 1937, she was one of the best shots in the city. She was also a mother. At 16, she had married a fellow student and given birth to a son, Rostislav. The marriage didn't last. Rostislav was raised by his grandparents, while Lyudmila worked and studied. She was 24, a single mother, a history student, and a trained sharpshooter when the world she knew ended. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was among the first volunteers at the Odessa recruiting office. She told them she wanted infantry. The registrar told her to be a nurse. She refused. She showed them her certificates, her sharpshooter badge, her 2 years of sniper school. They looked at the paperwork. They looked at her. They assigned her to the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. She was one of 2,000 women who would serve as snipers in the Red Army during the war. Only 500 of them would survive. For her first weeks, she didn't fire a shot. They gave her a grenade and put her on trench duty, digging communication lines and defensive positions. Then, in the second half of July 1941, a comrade was badly wounded by shrapnel and handed her his Mosin Nagant bolt-action rifle. On August 8, 1941, near the village of Bielyaivka, Pavlichenko set up her position and waited. A young soldier, a nice, happy boy, she called him later, set up beside her. Before either of them could take a shot, a German bullet killed him. He fell right next to her. She felt his blood on her hands. Something closed inside her, and something else opened. After that, she said, nothing could stop me. She killed 2 German scouts before the end of that day. Her war had begun. Over the next 12 months, Lyudmila Pavlichenko became the most dangerous person on the Eastern Front who wasn't driving a tank. She fought in Odessa and then in Moldavia, moving with her division as the Red Army retreated under the initial German onslaught. When her unit was pushed back to the Crimean Peninsula, she ended up in Sevastopol, a port city that the Germans besieged for 8 brutal months. Sevastopol was hell. Constant shelling, street fighting, rubble and dust and death around every corner. Pavlichenko operated in the ruins, setting up in bombed-out buildings, waiting for hours, taking one shot, relocating. The same methodology as Hayha in Finland, but in an urban nightmare instead of a frozen forest. Her kill count climbed. She was promoted to senior sergeant when she reached 100, promoted again to lieutenant when she passed 200. She killed officers, she killed scouts, she killed snipers. 36 Axis snipers fell to her rifle. Counter-sniping, the most dangerous assignment a sniper can receive, became her specialty. These were duels, one trained killer against another, both hidden, both patient, both knowing that the first one to make a mistake was dead. Some of these engagements lasted days. She won every single one. The Germans knew her name. They knew her count. They blared messages over loudspeakers toward the Soviet lines. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer. When the bribes didn't work, they tried threats. If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds. Pavlichenko heard the threat and laughed. They even knew my score, she said. By May 1942, her confirmed count stood at 257. The Soviets cited her officially. The number would reach 309, including those 36 enemy snipers, before her war was over. In June 1942, a mortar shell exploded near her position. Shrapnel tore into her face. She was evacuated by submarine from Sevastopol on the orders of Soviet High Command. She was too valuable to lose. She was 25 years old. She had been in combat for less than a year, and she had killed more enemy soldiers than entire platoons would manage in the course of the war. In September 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in Washington, D.C. The Soviets had sent her to America for a reason. Stalin needed Roosevelt to open a second front in Europe, an Allied invasion of Western Europe that would force Hitler to split his forces and relieve the catastrophic pressure on the Eastern Front. Pavlichenko, along with 2 other Soviet delegates, was sent to tour the United States, speak to the American people, and make the case for the Second Front. She was the first Soviet citizen ever received by an American president. Franklin Roosevelt welcomed her to the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to breakfast. And then she was released into the American press, where the questions began. They asked about her uniform. They asked about her hair. They asked about her weight. They called her the girl sniper. They wrote that her skirt was too long and her boots were too clunky. A Washington Post columnist titled her article, "Step-ins for the Amazons." Pavlichenko was bewildered, then frustrated, then furious. She had been shot at for a year. She had shrapnel scars on her face. She had killed 309 human beings with a rifle. And these people wanted to discuss her wardrobe? "I wish you could experience a bombing raid," she told one group of reporters. "Honestly, you would immediately forget about the cut of your outfit." Eleanor Roosevelt saw what was happening and took Pavlichenko under her wing. She traveled with her across the country, shielding her from the worst of the press, helping her find her voice in a culture that didn't know what to do with a woman who killed for a living. It worked. By the time the tour reached Chicago, Pavlichenko was done being polite. She stood on a stage, looked at the crowd, and delivered the line that would define her legacy in America. "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd went silent. Then they erupted. Charlie Chaplin kissed her fingers and said it was incredible that such a small hand had killed Nazis by the hundred. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about her. The United States government presented her with a Colt pistol. Canada gave her a Winchester rifle with a telescopic sight. And slowly, painfully, the Second Front began to build. Pavlichenko never returned to combat. The Soviets kept her off the front lines, too valuable as a symbol to risk as a soldier. She spent the rest of the war training snipers. The men and women she trained were credited with killing over 100 Axis soldiers during the Battle of Sevastopol alone. She was promoted to major. She was awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could give. She received the Order of Lenin twice. A postage stamp was printed in her image. After the war, she finished her degree at Kiev University and became a historian, the career she had wanted before the Germans invaded and the rifles called her name. But the war followed her home. Like so many soldiers, like every soldier, the things she had seen and done lived inside her long after the last shot was fired. She suffered from what we now call PTSD, though the Soviet Union had no name for it and no system to treat it. She struggled with depression. She struggled with alcohol. She carried the weight of 309 lives taken and 1,000 memories that wouldn't let her sleep. In 1957, 15 years after their tour across America, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Moscow. The Cold War was at its peak. Americans and Soviets were enemies now. But Eleanor insisted she would not leave Moscow without seeing her friend. The Soviets relented. Eleanor was brought to a small two-room apartment where Pavlichenko was living. A government minder sat in the room with them, watching, listening. The two women sat in the front room and spoke with careful, formal politeness. Then Pavlichenko made an excuse, pulled Eleanor into the bedroom, and closed the door. They laughed. They caught up. They talked about everything they'd shared in that strange, impossible summer of 1942, when a Soviet sniper and an American First Lady had traveled across a country together and become friends. It was the last time they saw each other. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died on October 10, 1974. She was 58 years old. A stroke took her. Her son, Rostislav, the boy she'd left behind to go to war at 24, was with her at the end. The Soviet Union had no decent veterans' care, no therapy, no palliative support. She died in pain, carrying wounds both visible and invisible that had never fully healed. A second postage stamp was printed in 1976. There are statues of her in Russia and Ukraine. A 2015 film called Battle for Sevastopol told a version of her story. Woody Guthrie's song is still played. Her Winchester rifle sits in a museum in Moscow. But the thing that stays with you isn't the medals or the stamps or the movie. It's the image of a 25-year-old woman standing on a stage in Chicago, looking out at a room full of men who had never heard a bullet fly, and asking them, quietly, politely, devastatingly, whether they'd been hiding long enough. 309 kills, 36 enemy snipers, 4 wounds, 1 question. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?